It was a regular Tuesday afternoon, and Marcus, a 30-year-old black man, was heading home from work. The streets were quiet, and he was lost in thought, still wearing his dark blue uniform from his job at the local tech company. Marcus was used to being stopped by police in his neighborhood, but he always tried to brush it off, convincing himself that not every cop was out to get him. But today felt different. As he turned the corner near his apartment, two white police officers suddenly approached him from behind. "Hey, you!" one of them shouted, as Marcus instinctively turned around, his hands already raised slightly, a learned reflex from years of unjust encounters. "What's the problem, officers?" Marcus asked calmly, trying to keep his voice steady, but there was a lump in his throat, that familiar knot of anxiety tightening. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a hard face and buzz cut, immediately got in his space, towering over him. "You match the description of a suspect in a robbery," he barked. Marcus knew this wasn't about a robbery. He wasn't wearing anything flashy, just his work clothes and a backpack with his laptop. "I just came from work," he explained, reaching slowly into his pocket to pull out his employee ID. "I've been at the office all day." But his words fell on deaf ears. The second officer, slightly younger but just as aggressive, moved to block his path. "Hands on the wall," he ordered. Marcus felt a cold chill run down his spine. His mind raced. Should he comply, or should he question them? Before he could decide, the older cop grabbed him, pushing him roughly against the wall of a nearby building. Without thinking, Marcus hit record on his phone, which was already in his hand. The officers were too focused on asserting their control to notice the quiet tap of the button. "What are you doing?" "I didn't do anything," Marcus protested, his voice shaking with fear and anger. But they didn't care. The younger officer twisted Marcus's arms behind his back too tight, while the other began patting him down aggressively. "You fit the description," the older officer repeated, his voice cold and detached, like Marcus was just another name on a list. But Marcus knew the truth. He knew this was about his skin color, about their assumptions, about them trying to assert dominance over him just because they could. As Marcus stood pinned to the wall, his chest tightened. He was trying hard to keep his composure, to not give them a reason to escalate things further, but inside, his heart was pounding. He'd seen the news. He knew how quickly things could go south. For what felt like an eternity, they continued to harass him, asking where he was coming from, where he was going, if he had anything illegal on him. It was the same tired script he'd heard before. All the while, his phone recorded every word, every shove, every humiliation. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was only minutes, the officers seemed to lose interest. They hadn't found anything on him because there was nothing to find. The younger cop stepped back, almost as if he was disappointed he didn't get a reason to go further. "You're free to go," the older officer grumbled, not even bothering to make eye contact with Marcus. Marcus, still shaking, gathered himself. "That's it?" he asked, incredulous. The officers were already walking away as if nothing had happened, leaving Marcus standing there, chest heaving, a mixture of rage and relief flooding his system. He stood still for a moment, catching his breath, and then glanced down at his phone. The screen was still lit, the video still recording. He had captured it all: the threats, the rough handling, the abuse. Marcus stared at the footage for a long moment. He hadn't planned to share it, hadn't even considered what to do with it. But in that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, Marcus woke up to his phone buzzing nonstop. He squinted at the screen, struggling to process the flood of notifications. Overnight, his video had spread far beyond his own social circle. It had been picked up by news outlets, reshared by influencers, and sparked conversations across multiple platforms. He scrolled through the comments, seeing a mix of reactions. Most were supportive, but a few were skeptical, questioning his motives or downplaying what had happened. Marcus' heart raced as he read some of the negative comments. Why didn't he just comply? Maybe if he wasn't acting suspicious, this wouldn't have happened. Not all cops are bad. The word stung, even though he had expected them. There was always pushback when someone like him spoke up, but seeing it firsthand was harder than he anticipated. He tossed his phone aside and sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. The weight of what he'd done was beginning to hit him. There was no turning back now. People knew his name, his face. The entire world knew his story. A knock on his door startled him. He glanced at the clock. It was barely 9 a.m. Who could it be this early? Opening the door, Marcus was surprised to see Jay standing there, a serious look on his face. "Man, you all right?" Jay asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure how true that was. "Yeah, just processing everything." Jay gave him a once-over and then pulled out his phone. "You've seen this, right? It's everywhere, bro. I told you it would blow up, but this is next level." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, man. I didn't expect it to be like this. The trolls, the hate, it's a lot." Jay sat down on the couch, shaking his head. "That's the internet for you. But don't let them get to you. You've got way more support than hate. People are rallying behind you. There's even a protest being organized downtown because of your video." A protest? Marcus felt a mix of shock and disbelief. This had spiraled so quickly. He had just wanted to share his story, maybe raise some awareness. Now there was a full-blown movement happening in his name. "Yeah, man," Jay said, scrolling through his phone. "People are demanding change, police accountability, an end to racial profiling. You've started something big." Marcus sat down heavily, trying to wrap his head around it all. He had always admired people who stood up for justice, who fought for what was right. But he had never seen himself as one of those people. He was just a regular guy, trying to live his life in peace. Now, though, he was in the spotlight, whether he liked it or not. Just then, his phone buzzed again, this time with a call from an unknown number. Hesitant, he answered it. "Hello, is this Marcus?" "Yeah, who's this?" he asked cautiously. "My name is Lisa Johnson. I'm a reporter with the National Gazette. We saw your video and would like to do an interview with you about your experience. We believe your story could really make a difference." Marcus' heart skipped a beat. He had seen interviews like this before. People who had gone through traumatic experiences, retelling their stories on national television. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that kind of exposure. It felt overwhelming. "I don't know," Marcus began, but Jay waved at him, mouthing, "Do it." "Can I think about it?" Marcus asked, feeling the pressure mount. "Of course," Lisa replied, "but I wouldn't wait too long. This is the kind of story that can spark real change, Marcus. People need to hear your voice." After hanging up, Marcus slumped back on the couch. I don't know if I can do this," he admitted to Jay. "What if I mess it up? What if it doesn't change anything?" Jay gave him a reassuring look. "Look, man, you've already made an impact. People are talking. People are listening. All you have to do is keep going. You've got the truth on your side, and that's powerful." Marcus looked at his phone again, feeling the weight of everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. It was a lot to take in. But maybe Jay was right. He had already taken the first step. Now it was time to see it through. Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone, the weight of the last hour pressing on his chest. The video he had recorded was right there, a painful reminder of what he had just endured. Part of him wanted to delete it, to just forget the entire thing ever happened. After all, what good would come from posting it? He had seen others share their stories, but too often it felt like nothing changed. He scrolled through the clip again, his hands trembling slightly. The harsh voices of the officers echoed in his mind, their cold, unfeeling commands, the way they dismissed him, like he was nothing. He had been through enough of these moments in his life, but this time was different. He had proof, but what would he do with it? His phone buzzed in his hand, breaking his focus. It was his friend Jay, a fellow software engineer, and one of the few people who understood what it was like to walk around with a target on your back. Marcus hadn't told Jay what had happened yet, but as soon as he picked up the call, he heard the concern in his friend's voice. "Yo, you good? You sound off," Jay said, his voice laced with suspicion. "Everything all right?" For a moment, Marcus hesitated. Should he tell him? Was it even worth it? But before he could stop himself, the words came spilling out, the stop, the accusations, the recording. The whole time, Jay listened quietly, not interrupting, just letting Marcus unload. When he finished, Jay took a deep breath. "Man, I am sorry. Bro, you good though? You safe now?" "Yeah, I'm fine," Marcus said, though his voice still sounded uncertain. "Just don't know what to do now. I have the video. I could post it, but..." Jay cut him off. "You have to share it. This isn't just about you, man. It's bigger than that. People need to see what's happening. If you let this slide, it's like letting them win." Marcus leaned back against the wall, staring up at the ceiling. He knew Jay was right. Deep down, he knew he couldn't just let this go. But still, there was fear. Fear of what would happen if he put himself out there like that. What if people didn't believe him? What if it made things worse? "What if they come after me?" Marcus said quietly, voicing the fear he hadn't wanted to admit out loud. "They won't," Jay said, sounding more certain than Marcus felt. "Look, I'll help you. We'll be smart about it. You've got the truth on your side. You know how powerful that is." The silence hung in the air for a moment before Marcus finally spoke again. "All right," he said, his voice steadier this time. "I'll do it." It was a simple decision, but one that felt monumental. He sat there for a moment, still processing the weight of it. Then, with a deep breath, he opened up his social media. His thumb hovered over the screen for what felt like an eternity. Once he posted this, there was no going back. But before he could talk himself out of it, Marcus hit upload. The video was out in the world now. He didn't know what would come next, but at least he had taken the first step. The hours that followed were a blur. His phone buzzed constantly, comments, messages, people sharing the video. By the time he finally looked at it again, the video had gone viral. Thousands of people had watched it, liked it, shared it. The comments were full of outrage, disbelief, and support. But it wasn't just strangers reaching out. Local activists, community leaders, and even a few news outlets had started contacting him, asking for interviews, wanting to know his story. What had started as a terrible encounter with the police was quickly turning into something much bigger than Marcus had ever imagined. By the end of the night, he sat in his dark apartment, the glow of his phone the only light in the room. He had done it. He had taken a stand. But as he stared at the messages flooding in, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Relief, fear, and uncertainty about what tomorrow would bring. For now, though, he had done what he needed to do. Tomorrow would be a different battle. The following day, Marcus found himself sitting in a small coffee shop downtown, nervously tapping his foot. Across from him sat Lisa Johnson, the reporter who had called him the day before. She was polite, professional, but Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was the first time he would be telling his story publicly, beyond the video that had already gone viral. He took a sip of water, trying to calm his nerves. "I've never done anything like this before," he admitted, shifting in his seat. Lisa smiled kindly. "I understand. Just speak from the heart, Marcus. People need to hear what you went through in your own words." The camera crew had set up around them, and the soft hum of the equipment made Marcus hyper-aware of everything. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like the entire world was watching, even though it was just a handful of people in the room. Lisa adjusted her notepad and leaned in slightly, her expression warm but focused. "So, let's start with what happened that night. Can you walk us through it?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, glancing at the camera. Then, with a deep breath, he began. "It was late. I had just finished a shift at work and was walking home. I'd taken that route 100 times before, but this time felt different. I noticed a police car driving slowly behind me, but I didn't think much of it at first." His voice wavered slightly as he relived the memory. "But then, they pulled up next to me. 2 officers got out. They didn't ask any questions, just started accusing me of things. They said I looked like someone who had been reported for a robbery nearby. I told them I was just coming from work, but they didn't care." Marcus paused, his hands clenched in his lap. He could feel his heartbeat quicken as he remembered the fear that had gripped him that night. Lisa leaned in further, her voice gentle. "And that's when things escalated?" He nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, they pushed me against the wall, started searching me. I kept telling them I hadn't done anything, but they didn't listen. One of them grabbed my arm, twisted it behind my back, and that's when I started filming. I knew that if I didn't record it, no one would believe me." The camera crew stayed silent, capturing every word, every expression on Marcus' face. He could see the sympathy in Lisa's eyes, but more than that, he felt the weight of responsibility. His story wasn't just his anymore. It was a window into the experiences of so many others who had gone through the same thing. "What happened after you posted the video?" Lisa asked, her tone a bit sharper now, pushing the narrative forward. Marcus exhaled slowly. "At first, nothing. A few friends shared it, but then it started spreading. People I didn't know began messaging me, saying they had gone through similar things. And then the hate started coming in too. People saying I made it up, that I was just looking for attention. But I knew I couldn't let that stop me." Lisa nodded, scribbling down notes. The video has now been viewed by millions, and it sparked a national conversation about racial profiling and police abuse. "How do you feel about that?" Marcus paused again, considering his words carefully. "It's overwhelming," he admitted, "but it's also necessary. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been through this. I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did that night. Scared, helpless." Lisa gave him a moment before asking her next question, the one Marcus had been dreading. "Some people are calling you a hero, Marcus. Do you see yourself that way?" He shook his head quickly. "No, I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I did what I had to do to protect myself. If that helps others, then I'm glad. But I don't feel like a hero." The interview wrapped up shortly after, with Lisa thanking Marcus for his courage and promising that the piece would shed light on the systemic issues he had faced. As the camera crew packed up, Marcus felt a strange sense of relief. The hard part was over, or at least, so he thought. As he stepped out of the coffee shop into the cool afternoon air, his phone buzzed with a new notification. Another protest had been scheduled, this time right outside the police station, and they wanted him to speak. Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never spoken in front of a large group before, let alone a gathering this size. The air was charged with anticipation, a sea of people holding signs and chanting, their voices rising like a tidal wave. Many of the faces were strangers, but they had all come for the same reason: to demand justice. A small platform had been set up in front of the police station. As Marcus watched the organizers gather, he could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. He wasn't an activist, not a leader. He was just a guy who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now, it seemed, he had become something more. The organizer, a woman in her early 30s with a megaphone, spotted Marcus and waved him over. "You ready?" she asked, her eyes serious but encouraging. Marcus swallowed hard and nodded, even though he wasn't sure if he was. His hands felt clammy, and the noise of the crowd seemed to grow louder as he approached the platform. He climbed a few steps and stood in front of the microphone, his heart hammering in his chest. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The crowd quieted slightly, waiting for him. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, and it felt overwhelming. But then he remembered why he was there. He wasn't speaking just for himself. He was speaking for everyone who had ever felt the crushing weight of injustice. "I'm not a public speaker," Marcus began, his voice shaky at first. "I'm just a guy who was walking home one night." The crowd listened in silence as Marcus recounted his story, the same story he had told Lisa in the interview. But this time, it felt different. The raw emotion of that night came flooding back as he spoke about the fear, the humiliation, and the anger. He described the moment he decided to film the encounter, knowing that it was his only defense against a system that saw him as guilty before proven innocent. "I didn't want to be here," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "I didn't ask to become a symbol for anything, but here we are, and if my story can make a difference, then I'm going to keep telling it, because this has to stop." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy washing over him like a wave. Marcus felt the weight of their support, the power of their collective voice. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. As Marcus stepped down from the platform, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't another protest announcement. It was a message from an unexpected source. A few hours later, Marcus found himself sitting in his small apartment, staring at his phone screen. The message was still there, glowing on the screen like some kind of beacon. It was from a law firm, a well-known one at that. They had seen his video, followed the protests, and now they wanted to represent him in a civil suit against the police department. Marcus was stunned. He hadn't even considered legal action. He had just wanted to get his story out there and let people know what had happened to him. But now, the possibility of real justice was staring him in the face. His mind raced with questions. Should he do it? Could he do it? He didn't know the first thing about legal cases, and the idea of taking on the police department seemed daunting, to say the least. But then he thought about everything that had happened. The arrest, the interrogation, the looks of suspicion that had followed him for days afterward. He thought about all the messages he had received from people who had gone through the same thing, people who were still afraid to speak up. If he could stand up to the police department, maybe it would show others that they could do the same. After a moment of hesitation, Marcus typed out a response to the law firm. He wasn't sure if this was the right move, but it felt like the next step in this journey he hadn't planned on taking. Within hours, a reply came through. They wanted to meet with him that week to discuss the details of the case. Marcus sat back in his chair, the enormity of what he had just done sinking in. This wasn't just about telling his story anymore. This was about fighting for real change. As the meeting day approached, Marcus felt a mix of emotions. He was nervous, of course, but there was also a sense of determination building inside him. This was bigger than him now. It was about holding people accountable, about making sure that what happened to him didn't happen to anyone else. When he walked into the law firm's office, he was greeted by a team of lawyers who seemed genuinely invested in his case. They talked him through the legal process, explaining that while it wouldn't be easy, they believed he had a strong case. They discussed possible outcomes, settlements, and even the chance of taking the case to court. By the time Marcus left the meeting, his mind was spinning with information. But one thing was clear: he was in this for the long haul. The day of the trial arrived faster than Marcus expected. He sat in the courtroom, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his heart pounding. The room was filled with reporters, community members, and others who had followed his case from the beginning. The police officers involved in his arrest sat on the opposite side of the room, their expressions unreadable. As the trial began, Marcus listened as his lawyers laid out the case. They played the video he had recorded that night, the grainy footage showing the officers pinning him against the wall, their harsh voices echoing in the quiet courtroom. The jury watched intently, their faces betraying a mix of emotions: shock, anger, and disgust. One by one, witnesses were called to the stand. Friends and co-workers testified to Marcus' character, painting a picture of a hard-working man who had never been in trouble with the law. Then came the police officers. Their testimonies were filled with contradictions, their attempts to justify their actions sounding increasingly weak under cross-examination. As Marcus watched the trial unfold, he felt a strange sense of detachment. It was as if he was watching someone else's life play out in front of him. But then, when it was his turn to take the stand, reality came crashing back. His lawyer led him through the events of that night, just as Lisa had done during the interview. But this time, every word felt heavier, more significant. He wasn't just recounting a story. He was fighting for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been in his position. The cross-examination was brutal. The defense attorney tried to paint Marcus as a troublemaker, someone who had provoked the officers. But Marcus remained calm, his answers steady and precise. He wasn't going to let them twist the truth. When the trial finally came to a close, Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and a lingering sense of uncertainty. The jury had been sent to deliberate, and now all he could do was wait. The wait for the jury's decision felt like an eternity. Marcus sat in the courtroom, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the empty jury box. The entire trial had been an emotional roller coaster, and now, after all the testimony, the arguments, and the endless hours of tension, everything hinged on this moment. Finally, the door to the jury room opened, and the jurors filed back into their seats. Marcus held his breath as the foreperson stood up, a sheet of paper in hand. His heart pounded in his chest, every beat reverberating in his ears. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before the weight of them sank in. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him, his body sagging slightly in his seat. He had won. Justice had been served. But more than that, Marcus knew that this wasn't just a personal victory. This was a victory for everyone who had been wronged by the system, everyone who had suffered in silence. The courtroom erupted into applause, and Marcus could see people crying, hugging, and celebrating the verdict. As he left the courthouse, the crowd outside cheered. Reporters rushed toward him, microphones and cameras thrust into his face, but Marcus was too overwhelmed to speak. He had done it. He had fought back, and he had won. But the journey wasn't over. Over the next few weeks, Marcus became a symbol of hope and resilience. His story was picked up by national news outlets, and his face appeared on talk shows and interviews. He spoke passionately about the need for reform, about holding those in power accountable, and about the importance of standing up against injustice. He was no longer just a man who had been wronged. He was now a voice for the voiceless. The movement he had unknowingly sparked began to grow. Protests continued to pop up across the country, calling for meaningful change in the way law enforcement operated. Marcus found himself at the center of it all, speaking at rallies, meeting with lawmakers, and working alongside activists who had been fighting for these changes long before his video had gone viral. Despite the recognition, Marcus remained humble. He knew that he wasn't the hero of this story. He was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. There were countless others who had been through similar experiences, and many of them hadn't had the opportunity to tell their stories. Marcus was determined to use his platform to amplify their voices, to make sure that their stories were heard too. One day, as Marcus stood on a stage at yet another protest, looking out at the sea of faces before him, he felt a deep sense of purpose. This wasn't the life he had planned, but it was the life he had been given. And now, he was going to make sure it counted. The crowd began to chant his name, but Marcus raised his hands to quiet them. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice strong and clear. "This is about all of us. This is about justice. And we're just getting started." The crowd roared in response, their voices filled with hope and determination. As Marcus stepped back from the microphone, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had found his calling. He had found his voice. And the world was finally listening.